Apache woman locked in a box sold for $5, until a cowboy offered more. The air was dry, filled with the scent of sand, sagebrush, and the faint smoke of cooking fires. Townspeople were already stirring, opening their small wooden shops, sweeping the dusty sidewalks, and tending to their horses tied to posts outside. Children ran between buildings, their laughter mixing with the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional shout from a distant rancher calling for his cattle. Life here moved slowly, and yet the presence of the soldiers and settlers reminded everyone that danger was never far away. In the center of the town, a strange sight drew the attention of everyone passing by. On a raised wooden platform, there sat a small, crude box, just large enough to hold a single person. It was old and worn, its edges chipped, and the lid had been removed, but iron bars had been fitted across the opening to prevent escape. Inside the box, the Apache woman sat, her body tense, her eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of fear and defiance. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark, intense eyes and long black hair that fell in a tangle over her shoulders. Her clothing was simple, made of rough fabric that had seen better days, and her hands rested stiffly on her knees, gripping the edges of the box as though she could hold herself together in that confined space through sheer willpower. The townspeople gathered around the box with curiosity, some whispering to each other, others pointing and shaking their heads in disbelief. It was not every day that a captive from a distant Apache camp was brought into town, locked in such a humiliating way, and offered for sale. Some people looked at her with pity, though they did nothing to help. Others were more interested in the novelty of the situation, treating it like a spectacle, as if she were some strange animal to be observed rather than a human being with a story, a family, and a life of her own. Her heart raced each time a person drew near, and she kept her gaze low, trying not to provoke further attention or anger. She knew that one wrong move, one hint of resistance could make the day even harder, maybe even dangerous. The woman's mind wandered back to how she had ended up in this box, chained not by iron alone, but by circumstances she had never imagined for herself. She remembered the quiet mornings at her village, the laughter of children, the smell of wood smoke from cooking fires, and the songs sung during evenings around the fire. She remembered the sudden chaos, the horses thundering across the land, the shouting, and the confusion as strangers arrived and her world was turned upside down. She had tried to run, had hidden among the rocks and the sparse brush, but there were too many of them, and eventually she was captured. That memory, fresh and vivid, both frightened and strengthened her. Though she was confined now, though her body was restricted and her spirit tested, she had survived what many could not, and that knowledge gave her a quiet strength. Back on the town platform, a man stepped forward, his worn hat pulled low over his eyes and a thin smirk on his face. He carried a small purse, jingling faintly as he moved, and his boots kicked up clouds of dust with each step. He was one of the many who had come to see the woman, but now he was ready to make his offer. $5. The words were small, almost absurd in their casualness, but they carried the weight of ownership in that world, a price for a human life, stripped down to coins. The crowd murmured, some laughing, some simply watching in silence, unsure how to respond. The woman's stomach sank. $5. That was all they valued her at, all the pain, fear, and dignity she carried seemingly reduced to a handful of metal coins. She looked up briefly, catching the eyes of a few onlookers who seemed uncomfortable, who avoided looking at her with genuine recognition of her humanity. She wanted to plead, to explain that she was more than a price, that she was more than a spectacle, but the words could not escape her lips. In this moment, her voice was trapped just as tightly as her body. Instead, she drew a slow, steadying breath, telling herself that she must endure, that she must survive, and that somehow she would find a way out of this nightmare. Her mind began searching for possibilities, imagining escape, imagining rescue, imagining a life beyond this wooden prison, even if it felt impossibly far away. The seller, seeing her reaction, chuckled and patted the edge of the box as if it were a showpiece. $5 and she's yours, he said loudly, projecting his voice so the crowd could hear. Some nodded approvingly, considering the deal fair. Others whispered among themselves, shaking their heads at the absurdity of the situation. The woman felt a wave of despair wash over her, but she kept her composure, her face calm even as her heart pounded against her chest. She could not let them see her fear. It was all she had left in that moment, the silent knowledge that she was a person, not an object to be bought and sold. As she sat in the box, the day stretched on. People came and went, some stopping briefly to observe, some staying longer to speculate about who would buy her next or what her life had been before captivity. Each face that passed seemed to judge her in some way, even if they did not speak. She learned quickly who might be sympathetic and who might be cruel, watching the crowd like a hawk watches the field below. Every movement, every whisper, was a signal that could guide her decisions, though at the time, she could only hope that someone would see her not as a curiosity, but as a person who deserved freedom and respect. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, turning the wooden planks of the platform hot beneath her bare hands. She shifted slightly, trying to ease the stiffness of her body, but the box allowed very little movement. She could feel the dry, gritty texture of the wood beneath her fingers, and the roughness of the rope that bound her wrists when the seller had first placed her inside. Yet despite the discomfort, she remained composed, holding herself upright, her head high even as her heart ached. It was a small act of rebellion against the humiliation, a reminder to herself that even in captivity, she still controlled her dignity. And then, as if from nowhere, a new presence entered the crowd, a figure that stood out from the rest. He was a cowboy, tall and strong, with a calm confidence that drew the eyes of the onlookers. His boots kicked up dust as he walked, and his gaze immediately found her in the box. Unlike others, he did not laugh or whisper behind his hand. Instead, he studied her for a moment, taking in her expression, her posture, and the small, almost imperceptible signs of resilience in her eyes. He seemed to understand, even without words, that she was not an object or a prize, but a human being trapped in a cruel situation. The townspeople noticed him too, murmuring as he approached the platform. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if something was about to change, and for the first time that day, the woman felt a spark of hope. She did not know him, could not predict his intentions, but there was a difference in the way he moved, the way he carried himself. He spoke quietly, politely, yet with authority, and the seller paused, unsure how to respond. For the woman, it was a moment that seemed almost magical, a reminder that even in the darkest times, someone could see her humanity, and that perhaps freedom was not as far away as it had seemed. The cowboy's presence was a silent promise, a flicker of possibility in the midst of despair. And as the sun beat down on the dusty streets, the woman sat in her box, holding onto that hope, waiting for what might come next, determined to survive whatever challenges lay ahead. The cowboy moved through the crowd with a calm confidence that made people step aside without a word. His boots kicked up dust, and the soft jingle of his spurs was barely audible, yet his presence carried a weight that drew attention. Unlike the others who had gathered to watch or mock the woman in the box, he seemed purposeful, measured, and aware. His eyes, sharp and clear, were fixed on her, taking in every detail, the tension in her hands, the wary glance she gave to the crowd, and the quiet dignity that refused to be broken despite her situation. As he approached, the townspeople whispered among themselves. Some admired his courage, others questioned it. "Who does he think he is?" muttered a man at the back of the crowd. Another shook his head. "Don't see why he's getting involved. It's not his concern." But the cowboy paid no attention to the murmurs. He was not here for gossip, nor for curiosity. He had seen enough injustice in his life to recognize it when it stood before him, plain and undeniable. The Apache woman felt her heart skip a beat. She had grown used to the indifferent or mocking glances of the crowd, but there was something different in the way he looked at her. It was not pity, and it was not ownership. It was understanding. It was recognition of her humanity. Her hands tightened briefly on the edges of the box, and she straightened her back, trying to gather the strength to meet his gaze. The cowboy stopped a few feet away from the platform, looking the seller in the eye. "How much is she being sold for?" he asked calmly, his voice carrying across the space between them. The seller, a man with a crooked smile and weathered skin, puffed out his chest. $5, he said, almost proudly, as if stating the amount was a feat in itself. The crowd reacted with a mix of laughter and surprise. $5 for a living person. Some thought it outrageous, others barely blinked. The cowboy's eyes remained steady on the seller. $5. That's all. His tone was neither harsh nor accusatory, but it carried the weight of quiet disbelief. The seller shrugged. "That's the price. You want her, you pay up. Otherwise, someone else will." He gestured toward the woman in the box, as if she were nothing more than an object on display. The Apache woman felt a wave of tension. The conversation could have gone in any direction, and she had learned to be cautious. Any hint of resistance, any sudden movement might provoke anger. She sat perfectly still, watching him, unsure if he would act in his words or simply leave. She had almost given up hope of someone helping her, and yet something in his presence sparked a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, she would not remain in that box forever. The cowboy reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch of coins. He shook it lightly, letting the coins rattle. The sound caught the attention of the crowd and whispers spread like wildfire. "He's going to pay more," someone said. "How much?" asked another. The cowboy's gaze shifted briefly to the woman, and in that small glance she saw something reassuring. He was not buying her for sport or for show, but to free her. "I'll give $20, he said, his voice firm and deliberate. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. The crowd murmured louder this time. $20, 4 times the original price. Some looked shocked, others impressed, but the seller's expression changed first. He hesitated, studying the man before him. The cowboy did not raise his voice or gesture aggressively. He simply waited, his presence steady, his eyes locked on the seller. The seller considered the offer. $20 was a fair sum for him, more than enough to make him smile at the end of the day. Yet something in the cowboy's gaze made him pause. There was a firmness there, a calm determination that suggested this man would not be easily swayed or intimidated. After a few moments of quiet tension, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "20 it is. But don't expect me to go easy on you again." His tone was half jest, half warning, but the cowboy only nodded in acknowledgement. The woman's heart raced. She could hardly believe it. Someone had offered more. Someone had actually seen her as more than a handful of coins. Relief washed over her in small waves, mingled with the lingering fear that this too might be a trick, a temporary reprieve that could vanish at any moment. But the cowboy's steady demeanor and genuine attention gave her courage. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to hope that freedom was within reach. The cowboy moved closer to the box. He crouched slightly, bringing himself nearer to her eye level without making sudden movements. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. His voice was soft, careful, carrying neither judgment nor fear, only concern. She nodded slightly, not trusting her voice just yet. Her throat felt dry, and words seemed too heavy to form. But in her eyes he could see the gratitude, the fear, and the cautious trust beginning to grow. The crowd watched in silence, sensing that something important was unfolding. The woman had been reduced to an object for amusement, a commodity to be bought and sold, But here was a man who treated her as a person. People began to murmur quietly among themselves, some expressing admiration, others confusion. It was unusual, almost shocking for someone to step in for another's humanity, but the cowboy seemed unconcerned by the social expectations or gossip. He only focused on her. With the coins exchanged, the seller unlocked the small padlock on the box. The sound of the metal turning and the click of the lock was loud in the quiet that had settled over the crowd. The woman held her breath as the lid of the box was lifted, the iron bars giving way under careful hands. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if it was real or another cruel trick. Then she felt the cool air on her face, the warmth of sunlight that had been denied her while she sat confined. The cowboy extended his hand to help her out. She grasped it carefully, testing his intentions. When he held her firmly yet gently, she allowed herself to be lifted from the box. Her legs were stiff, her body sore from hours of confinement, but the simple act of standing, of being free to move, filled her with a powerful sense of relief. She took a deep breath, feeling the space around her, the freedom she had almost forgotten existed. As she stepped down from the platform, the cowboy guided her to the edge of the crowd. He did not speak much, but his presence was steady, protective. The woman glanced back at the townspeople, who had been watching the entire time. Some avoided her eyes, unsure how to react. Others gave a brief nod of acknowledgement. She did not know them, and perhaps she never would. But in this moment, they no longer mattered. What mattered was that she had someone who had seen her humanity, who had acted to help her, and that gave her courage. The journey away from the platform was careful and deliberate. The cowboy led her along quiet alleys and across open spaces, always alert, always watching for anyone who might follow or interfere. Each step she took was a step toward freedom, a step away from fear, and each movement made her heart beat faster with a mix of excitement and lingering caution. She was still wary. She had been betrayed before, but there was a growing sense of trust forming between them. The cowboy did not ask questions immediately. He seemed to understand that the moment was delicate, that the woman needed time to recover from the shock of being freed. He walked beside her, giving her space, yet remaining close enough that she could feel his support. The journey was slow, filled with pauses as they navigated the dusty terrain and avoided the attention of others. She observed him as well, noting his careful movements, the quiet confidence in his steps, and the calm determination that had brought her out of the box. For the woman, each passing moment without confinement was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had been locked in a box, treated as less than human, and yet here she was, moving through the world freely, guided by someone who cared enough to intervene. Her mind raced with possibilities. What awaited her now? Who could be trusted, and where would she go? And yet, for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel a spark of hope. She would survive this day, and perhaps, with time, she would reclaim more than just her immediate freedom. The cowboy finally paused at the edge of the town, near a shaded area where the sun did not beat down so harshly. He gestured for her to rest. "Take your time," he said gently. "We'll figure out the next steps together." She nodded, feeling the tension in her body begin to ease slightly. It was a small gesture, but it carried reassurance, a promise that she was no longer alone in her struggle. In that quiet moment, away from the platform and the crowd, the Apache woman allowed herself to reflect on the day's events. She had been locked away, sold for a paltry sum, and yet within hours a stranger had recognized her worth and acted to restore her dignity. It was a powerful lesson in resilience, courage, and the kindness that could exist even in harsh, unforgiving places. She realized that freedom was not only the absence of physical chains, but also the presence of someone willing to act in justice and compassion. And as the cowboy stood beside her, quietly watching over her, she felt a sense of calm she had not known in weeks. For the first time, the possibility of a life beyond fear and confinement seemed real, and she knew that, with careful steps and the guidance of someone who understood the value of human dignity, she could begin to reclaim her life. The town was slowly returning to its usual rhythm as the cowboy and the Apache woman moved away from the dusty streets and curious eyes. The crowd that had gathered on the platform began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the background. Life went on as usual for the townspeople, but for the woman, the events of the day had changed everything. The wooden box, the laughter, the whispers, and the offer of $5 were already beginning to feel like a distant nightmare. Yet, she knew she could not relax completely. Freedom was not guaranteed, and the world outside that town was vast and unpredictable. She had to remain cautious. The cowboy guided her along a narrow path that led away from the center of town, his boots crunching against loose stones and dirt. He moved with quiet assurance, alert to the sounds of the town fading behind them, listening for any sign of pursuit or trouble. The woman followed closely but carefully, her hands brushing against the sides of the path as if to anchor herself to the solid earth beneath her feet. Every step was unfamiliar, the open space, the sunlight on her skin, the freedom to breathe deeply without the confining walls of the box. It was both exhilarating and frightening. "Take it slow," the cowboy said, his voice gentle but firm. "We don't want anyone following us without noticing." He kept his eyes scanning the path ahead and behind, showing her that he had thought through every detail of their escape from the crowd. The woman nodded slightly, appreciating the consideration and careful planning. It was clear he had experience, that he understood the dangers of the world around them, and that gave her a sense of security she had not felt since before her capture. She could feel her legs trembling slightly, stiff from hours of confinement, but she refused to let the weakness show. The cowboy did not rush her, instead matching his pace to hers, allowing her to regain her strength gradually. Along the way, she stole glances at him, observing his focused expression, the calm in his movements, and the quiet strength that radiated from him. Unlike the townspeople who had treated her as less than human, he seemed to see her fully, recognizing both her vulnerability and her resilience. As they walked further from the town, the landscape began to change. The dusty streets gave way to open plains dotted with scrubby bushes, rocky outcrops, and distant hills that shimmered under the afternoon sun. The wind carried the scent of wild grass and the faint aroma of distant water. Birds called from the trees and low cliffs, their songs contrasting sharply with the chaotic noises of the town. The Apache woman felt a small surge of relief at the open air around her. She could move without restraint, hear without interference, and see a world that was hers to navigate once more. Despite the beauty of the surroundings, she remained cautious. Her mind was alert, remembering how quickly her life had been turned upside down. She recalled the sounds of shouting, the sudden rush of horses, and the feeling of being overpowered and confined. Those memories were still vivid, and though the cowboy had rescued her, she understood that the world was full of danger and trust had to be earned. Every glance she cast around the open landscape was careful, noting the movement of the wind, the shadows that shifted across the ground, and the distant outlines of hills that might hide observers. The cowboy noticed her vigilance. "It's all right," he said gently. "You're safe with me. Nobody will hurt you while I'm here." His words were calm, but they carried a promise of protection, a reassurance that she could rely on him in this moment. She hesitated briefly, then nodded, feeling a small weight lift from her chest. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to breathe freely without fear of immediate danger. Yet, even as relief spread through her, she remained alert, understanding that safety required awareness, not blind trust. They continued along the path in silence for a while, the only sounds being the crunch of dirt under their boots, the distant calls of birds, and the whispering of the wind through the sparse vegetation. Silence can be comforting, yet it also allows thoughts to surface, and the Apache woman's mind wandered back to her village, to the life she had known before capture. She remembered the laughter of children, the warmth of family gatherings, the smell of fires in the evening, and the songs that were sung under the stars. Each memory carried both pain and strength, reminding her of what had been taken and what she still carried within her. The cowboy seemed to sense her thoughts. "It's hard, I know," he said softly, "to think about home when so much has changed, but you're not alone anymore. We'll get through this together." His voice did not demand trust, it invited it. The woman met his gaze, noticing the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that someone could truly care, that someone could act with kindness without expecting anything in return. It was a new feeling, one that brought both comfort and uncertainty. As they moved deeper into the open plains, the cowboy began to explain their plan. "We need to get to a safe place, somewhere away from the town, away from people who might try to find you again," he said. He spoke clearly and patiently, understanding that she needed both guidance and reassurance. The woman listened attentively, absorbing each word, evaluating the practicality of the plan. She could see that he had thought through every detail, and that careful planning gave her hope that this escape could succeed. The journey was not easy. The terrain was uneven, with rocks and brush making progress slow. The woman's legs ached from the hours of confinement, and her hands were sore from gripping the box's edges earlier. Yet, with each step, she felt her strength returning. The open air, the freedom to move, and the quiet encouragement of the cowboy helped her regain a sense of control over her body and her destiny. She began to walk more confidently, her eyes scanning the horizon not just for danger but for signs of hope, distant trees, a clear path, and the possibility of safety beyond the hills. As the afternoon wore on, they paused near a small grove of trees that offered shade from the relentless sun. The cowboy gestured for her to rest, and she lowered herself to the ground, feeling the relief of sitting on solid earth instead of the constraining box. He remained standing nearby, scanning the surroundings, ever vigilant, ensuring that no one was following. She studied him quietly, appreciating his attentiveness, his patience, and the careful balance of strength and gentleness he showed. "You've been through a lot," he said after a moment, his voice soft but steady. "But you're stronger than you know. We'll take it one step at a time. No rush, no pressure. Just focus on getting your strength back." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight of reassurance. She nodded, allowing herself to feel a little more at ease. The recognition of her strength, even in the face of vulnerability, helped her gather courage she had thought was lost. While she rested, the cowboy shared stories of his own travels, of dangers faced and hardships overcome. He did not share these to boast, but to build a connection, to show her that challenges could be met with courage and careful planning. She listened, intrigued, drawing inspiration from his experiences and comparing them to her own trials. Each story he told seemed to emphasize a common lesson: resilience, awareness, and the quiet determination to survive even the harshest conditions. Eventually, it was time to move again. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains. The cowboy helped her to her feet, steadying her as she adjusted to the movement. She felt a renewed sense of determination, fueled by the knowledge that she was no longer alone, that she had someone willing to guide and protect her. Each step forward was a reclaiming of her freedom, a small victory over the fear and captivity she had endured. As they continued, they encountered small obstacles, loose stones, tangled brush, and uneven ground, but each was met with patience and care. The cowboy offered his hand when needed, helped her navigate tricky spots, and encouraged her to keep moving. She began to trust him more with each passing moment, realizing that his actions matched his words. The cautious hope she had felt earlier now started to solidify into a quiet confidence that this journey could indeed lead her to safety. The sun finally began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. They found a small natural alcove near the side of a hill to rest for the night. The cowboy prepared a simple camp, gathering firewood and ensuring the area was safe. The woman watched him, noting his efficiency, careful attention, and respect for the environment around them. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for his presence, not just as a protector, but as someone who seemed to understand the fragile balance between caution and trust. As the first stars appeared in the sky, the Apache woman reflected on the day's events. From being locked in a box and offered for a mere $5 to being freed and guided towards safety by a man who genuinely cared, her life had shifted dramatically. She had survived not only the physical confinement, but also the emotional and psychological weight of her ordeal. Now, with the night falling around them, she felt the first real sense of hope she had experienced in weeks. The cowboy sat near the small fire he had built, keeping watch as she settled down nearby. They did not speak much, but the silence was comfortable, filled with mutual understanding and quiet trust. She knew the journey ahead would not be easy, that dangers might still lie ahead, but she also knew that she was no longer facing them alone. With careful steps, cautious optimism, and the guidance of someone who respected her strength and humanity, she began to imagine a future beyond fear and confinement. The night settled over the plains like a soft blanket, quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. The stars shone brilliantly, scattered across the dark sky like tiny lanterns, and the moon cast a silver glow over the rolling landscape. The Apache woman lay close to the small fire the cowboy had built, her body still tense from the long day of confinement and cautious movement. Though she was free from the box, her mind and muscles were slow to adjust, and every sound in the night made her flinch slightly. The cowboy kept watch beside the fire, his eyes alert to any movement in the darkness. He had learned through experience that danger could appear when least expected, and he understood that vigilance was as important as courage. Yet despite his cautious watch, there was an ease to his presence, a calm confidence that reassured the woman without needing to speak. She felt safer knowing he was nearby, a silent protector who had brought her out of captivity and continued to guide her toward safety. After some time, the cowboy spoke softly. "We'll rest here tonight, but at first light we need to move again. There's a safe place not far from here, a cabin where you can recover properly." His voice was steady, carrying neither command nor impatience, only certainty. The woman nodded, grateful for his guidance. She wanted to speak, to ask questions about the cabin, about what would happen next, but her throat was still dry from the long day. Instead, she simply rested, listening to his voice, letting it ground her in the present. Sleep was difficult at first. Her body ached, and her mind was filled with images of the box, the crowd, and the uncertainty of her fate. But gradually, fatigue took over, and she drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. The cowboy remained awake, tending the small fire and keeping watch. The wind shifted occasionally, rustling the leaves and carrying the distant sounds of nocturnal animals, but nothing threatened them. He checked the perimeter silently, making sure that no curious eyes had followed, and satisfied himself that they were undisturbed. When the first light of dawn touched the plains, painting the hills with soft shades of pink and gold, the cowboy gently shook her awake. "Time to go," he said quietly. She opened her eyes, feeling the stiffness in her body, but the sunlight on her face was invigorating. Rising slowly, she followed him as they moved away from their makeshift campsite. The world seemed larger and brighter in the early morning light, and yet she knew that the journey was far from over. Every step forward was a step into the unknown, a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The path they took wound through open plains and rocky outcrops, with the cowboy leading and the woman following closely. He offered his hand when the terrain became tricky, helping her over stones and through patches of brush. She noticed how careful he was, not just with her physical safety but also with her dignity, never forcing her to move faster than she could manage. With each step, her confidence grew and the fear that had accompanied her since captivity began to ease. She began to trust him more, realizing that his actions matched his words and that he genuinely cared for her safety. Midway through the morning, they reached a narrow canyon that provided natural cover from any distant observers. The cowboy paused, scanning the cliffs and the terrain carefully. "We'll follow this canyon for a while. It's safer than the open plains," he explained. The woman nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness. The canyon walls rose on either side, casting long shadows across the path and giving a sense of shelter. As they moved through it, the woman felt a growing sense of freedom, as if the walls of the box she had been trapped in were being replaced by the solid strength of the natural world around her. Along the way, they encountered small obstacles, a fallen tree, a patch of loose rocks, and a shallow stream, but the cowboy guided her through each with patience. "Careful here," he would say, holding out his hand or pointing to a safe spot. Each time she followed his instructions, she felt a little more in control of her body and a little less like a helpless captive. The journey, though physically demanding, became a lesson in resilience and trust. She realized that she could rely on him, and at the same time she discovered her own strength, which had been buried under fear and confinement for far too long. By midday, the sun was high in the sky, and the heat began to press down on them. The cowboy found a shaded spot beneath a large rock formation, where they could rest briefly and drink from a small water skin he carried. The Apache woman bent down eagerly, grateful for the cool water and the brief respite. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice still hesitant but filled with sincere gratitude. The cowboy nodded, not seeking thanks but acknowledging it with a small, respectful smile. They rested for a short while, allowing their bodies to recover. The woman's muscles ached, and her feet were sore from hours of walking over uneven ground. Yet, she felt stronger than she had in days, bolstered by the knowledge that she was moving toward safety, guided by someone she could trust. The cowboy, noticing her fatigue, did not rush her. "We'll take it slow," he said. "There's no need to hurry. Safety is more important than speed." His words carried reassurance, and she drew strength from them, feeling that she was not alone in facing the challenges ahead. As they resumed their journey, the cowboy spoke of the cabin where they would rest for the night. He described it as small but sturdy, hidden in a grove of trees, far enough from town that no one would find them. He explained that it had been left by a friend who trusted him, and it would provide shelter, food, and safety for as long as they needed. The woman listened intently, absorbing every detail. The thought of a real safe place, where she could finally recover from her ordeal, filled her with cautious hope. The afternoon passed slowly as they continued through the rugged terrain. Shadows lengthened, and the temperature began to drop slightly as the sun started its descent. The cowboy kept a careful pace, ensuring that she did not tire excessively. Every now and then, he would check behind them, ensuring that no one was following. Each time she glanced at him, she felt a renewed sense of trust. He was vigilant, patient, and careful, everything she needed in someone guiding her to safety. Eventually, they reached the grove of trees the cowboy had described. It was secluded, surrounded by dense foliage that blocked the view from any distance. A small cabin stood among the trees, simple but solid, with a thatched roof and sturdy wooden walls. The sight of it brought a wave of relief to the woman. Here, at last, was a place where she could rest fully, recover, and begin to feel safe again. The cowboy led her to the cabin's door and opened it, gesturing for her to enter first. She stepped inside cautiously, taking in the simple furnishings, the small fireplace, and the sense of protection the cabin offered. For the first time since her captivity, she felt she could truly relax. The cowboy set down their belongings and tended a small fire, preparing a simple meal for them both. He moved with quiet efficiency, showing care without drawing attention to the hardship they had endured. The woman watched him, feeling a mixture of gratitude and admiration. She realized that he had not only rescued her physically, but had also restored a sense of dignity and hope that she had feared lost. As evening fell, they sat by the fire, eating quietly. The woman felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. Her body was tired, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in weeks. She had survived the box, the sail, and the journey through the plains, and now she was here in a place of safety with someone who had proven trustworthy. The cowboy spoke little, but his presence alone was comforting. She began to understand that freedom was not just the absence of chains, it was the presence of trust, care, and the ability to choose her own path. The night grew darker and the fire crackled softly, casting warm light across the cabin. Outside, the sounds of the night, rustling leaves, distant calls of animals, and the whispering wind, provided a gentle backdrop to the quiet recovery taking place inside. The Apache woman reflected on the events of the past day, realizing how fragile life could be, yet also how resilient the human spirit was when met with courage and kindness. She had endured horrors she never imagined, yet she had survived and taken the first steps toward reclaiming her life. The cowboy finally spoke, breaking the comfortable silence. "Rest now," he said. "Tomorrow we'll continue, but for tonight you're safe." "Nothing will harm you here," she nodded, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly. She knew the journey ahead was still uncertain, but for now she could allow herself to recover, to breathe, and to begin imagining a future beyond fear. As she lay down on the simple bed prepared for her, she realized that safety was more than just physical shelter. It was the feeling of being seen, being cared for, and being given the chance to reclaim her life. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to sleep fully, knowing that the cowboy's vigilance and kindness would protect her through the night. The first light of morning filtered softly through the small windows of the cabin, painting the room in gentle shades of gold. The Apache woman stirred, stretching her arms and feeling a sense of relief she had not known for weeks. Her body was still sore from the long journey and hours of confinement in the box, but her mind felt lighter. The night in the cabin had been the first night she had slept without fear, and the warmth of the fire and the quiet presence of the cowboy beside her made her feel safe in a way she had almost forgotten existed. She rose slowly, testing her legs and appreciating the freedom of moving without restriction. Each step felt stronger, more certain, as though her body itself was remembering the power it had once taken for granted. The cowboy, already awake, was tending the small fire, quietly preparing a simple breakfast. He noticed her movement and offered a small smile. "Good morning. How do you feel?" he asked. His voice was calm, filled with genuine concern rather than obligation. The woman hesitated briefly before speaking. "Stronger," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet determination she had been cultivating since her release from the box. "And grateful." She paused, realizing that words alone could not express the depth of her gratitude. She had been treated as less than human for so long, sold for a mere $5, locked away as a spectacle. And yet here she was, alive, moving freely and beginning to feel a sense of hope she had almost forgotten. The cowboy nodded, acknowledging her words with a gentle understanding. They ate a simple meal in silence, the quiet only broken by the occasional crackle of the fire or the distant chirping of birds outside. The woman observed her surroundings, the sturdy wooden walls of the cabin, the small tools neatly arranged on the shelves, and the peaceful view through the windows. For the first time, she felt the possibility of a life beyond fear, a life where she could regain control over her own destiny. It was a new and fragile hope, yet it was powerful, giving her courage to imagine a future beyond the hardships she had endured. After breakfast, the cowboy began preparing for the next phase of their journey. "We can stay here for a few days if you need rest," he said, "but eventually you'll need to decide where you want to go next. Safety is important, and you deserve a place where you can live freely without fear." His words carried no pressure, only support. The woman listened carefully, realizing that for the first time in a long while, she had the power to make her own choices. The concept of choosing her own path without the threat of captivity or sale was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The morning passed slowly, filled with small tasks and quiet reflection. The woman began to stretch her limbs more confidently, moving around the cabin and testing her strength. She marveled at the sensation of walking freely, without the constraints of a box or the watchful eyes of a crowd. Each movement was a reminder of her resilience and a celebration of her survival. She realized that while her ordeal had been cruel and unjust, it had also revealed her inner strength, a determination that could not be broken by chains or threats. As the day wore on, the cowboy and the woman began to talk more openly. He shared stories of his travels, of people he had helped and dangers he had faced. He spoke not to boast, but to offer perspective, to show her that courage and careful action could overcome even the most challenging situations. The woman listened, sometimes speaking herself, recounting memories of her village, the songs of her people, and the life she had known before capture. Speaking aloud was difficult at first, but with each word she felt a small sense of liberation, as though reclaiming her voice was part of reclaiming her life. By afternoon, they stepped outside the cabin, moving into the shade of the grove surrounding it. The breeze was gentle, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. The woman closed her eyes briefly, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the freedom to stand tall without fear. The cowboy watched her quietly, giving her the space to absorb the moment. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel joy, a quiet and cautious happiness that came not from luxury or ease, but from safety, autonomy, and the simple knowledge that she was alive and free. The cowboy spoke softly. "You've come a long way in a short time. What happened to you, it shouldn't have, but you survived, and that strength will guide you forward." The woman looked at him, the words resonating deeply. She had survived more than anyone could imagine, and now, with someone she trusted by her side, she could begin to shape a life beyond fear. The cowboy's acknowledgement of her resilience reinforced her confidence, helping her understand that she was not defined by her suffering, but by her courage in enduring it. As evening approached, they prepared a small fire outside the cabin, watching the sky transform with hues of orange, pink, and deep purple. The woman reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the box in the center of the town, sold for $5, to the careful guidance and protection of the cowboy, and finally to the safety of this secluded grove. Each step had been perilous, yet each had also revealed her own inner strength and the kindness of someone who had acted with courage and compassion. Night fell, and the stars emerged, scattered across the sky like tiny points of hope. The woman felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for her physical safety, but for the restoration of her dignity and humanity. She realized that freedom was more than escape. It was the ability to breathe, to choose, to speak, and to move without constraint. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she could live according to her own will, guided by her own decisions. The cowboy spoke gently, "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we can plan your next steps. But remember, you are stronger than you know, and your life is your own to shape now." His words offered both reassurance and empowerment, reminding her that while the past had been cruel, the future held possibilities shaped by her own courage and choices. She nodded, feeling a quiet determination settle in her chest. Over the following days, the woman regained her strength. She explored the grove cautiously, learning the paths and the safe areas, while the cowboy taught her simple skills to help her navigate the environment. She began to understand the importance of awareness and preparation, lessons that would help her maintain her freedom. Each small achievement, walking longer distances, gathering firewood, moving safely through the grove, built her confidence and reinforced the sense that she could survive, thrive, and reclaim control over her life. The bond between the cowboy and the woman grew stronger, built on trust, respect, and shared experience. She saw him not only as a protector, but as someone who valued her courage and strength. And in turn, he saw her resilience, her intelligence, and her determination to survive despite the odds. Their connection was quiet, unspoken at times, yet profoundly impactful, reminding both of them that acts of courage and kindness could forge trust and hope even in the most challenging circumstances. Eventually, the day came when the woman felt ready to leave the cabin and venture further into the world beyond the grove. She had regained her physical strength, her confidence, and a sense of purpose. The cowboy supported her decision, helping her plan the journey ahead and ensuring that she had the skills and knowledge to move safely. She realized that while the journey had begun with fear and captivity, it would continue with courage, autonomy, and the lessons she had learned from surviving and trusting wisely. As they stood together outside the cabin, the sun rising behind the hills, the woman took a deep breath, savoring the warmth and the freedom around her. She turned to the cowboy, her eyes filled with gratitude and a quiet strength that had been forged through her ordeal. "Thank you," she said simply, though her voice carried the weight of everything she had endured and overcome. The cowboy nodded, offering a small, respectful smile, acknowledging her words without diminishing her independence. With careful steps, she moved forward into the open world, leaving the grove and cabin behind. Each step was a reclaiming of her life, a declaration that she would no longer be confined, sold, or diminished. The cowboy watched for a moment, proud of her courage and resilience, before giving her space to continue on her own. The journey ahead would not be without challenges, but she had discovered a strength within herself that would carry her through. The Apache woman paused once more, looking back at the grove and the man who had helped her find safety. A sense of gratitude, respect, and closure filled her. She had survived unimaginable hardship, been freed from captivity, and learned to trust again. Now, as she faced the horizon, the world felt wide, open, and full of possibilities. She was no longer a captive or a spectacle. She was a survivor, a person of strength, and the author of her own path. As she continued walking into the distance, the sun climbed higher, casting light across the land and illuminating the road ahead. The cowboy remained in the grove, watching her journey from a distance, satisfied that she had the courage, knowledge, and strength to continue on her own. And the Apache woman, feeling the wind on her face and the earth beneath her feet, embraced the freedom she had fought for, knowing that the past had shaped her but would not define her. She was free, she was strong, and her story, though marked by hardship, was now one of courage, resilience, and hope.